This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
My first question to you is, strangely enough, about poetry, because what I so admire about your prose in all your books is that it has the precision and mystery and intimacy of poetry combined with the epic reach of the novel. And I wondered if you could say something about your own relationship to poetry.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I've always looked at poetry as my model. I can never write poetry. I've never been able to write a verse, but I look at it as a model. And actually, before I start my day's work of writing, I love to start off by reading a little bit of poetry. I always have a book of poetry on my desk at my side, and may not have anything to do with my writing that day. But, it strikes the right note for me. It's like a musician really having to pluck that right note before he can start playing. Then I don't think of it as writing poetic prose after that, but it reminds me of the need for that precision, that selection of language, which even a novelist has to have.
There is that phrase, she doesn't suffer fools gladly. And I always think about Anita, she doesn't suffer words gladly. They're always there to do something. Anita and I met 23 years ago for 1 hour in Cambridge. Anita was a fellow at Girton College, and she was a well-established writer. I think Cold Light of Day had already been shortlisted for the Booker. You had 13 novels behind you. I was a fellow at Trinity College at the start of my career, and I was so awed when I met Anita Desai in the house of our mutual friend Elizabeth Wright, who we called Lizzie. And I don't know whether you remember, Lizzie was German, Jewish, she was a refugee. She'd baked a poppy seed cake.
Yes.
The real thing with a hole in the middle.
Right.
And I was so tongue-tied. I couldn't ask Anita what she was writing at the time. So, what were you writing when you were a fellow at Girton College?
Actually, now that you remind me of Lizzie's German past and the poppy seed cake, I remember what I was writing. It was Baumgartner's Bombay, and it was an exploration of the German part of my heritage. So that evening, in a way, fitted into what I was involved with at the moment.
There you go. You
yes.
have to ask 23 years later.
I couldn't have answered that earlier either. I just thought of it at this very minute.
Yes. So you had a Bengali father,
Yes.
German mother. So can I ask, what were the languages you spoke at home?
Well, because of my German mother, the very first language I heard or spoke was certainly German.
Yeah.
But at the same time, everyone around me, friends, neighbors, they all spoke Hindi, or mix of Hindi and Urdu, the two languages that were spoken in Old Delhi at that time. And so that came naturally too. And of course I was aware of my father's Bengali language, which we didn't hear very much of in Delhi, which was so far from his own home in Bengal. But there were all these languages around, and it was in a way very convenient. You always just snatched at the word, the language which was most appropriate to the occasion. And I shamefully still find myself doing that all the time. Never have learned to speak one language in any pure, correct form.
You've always written in English, and you've described English as your literary language. Can you explain what the difference between a literary language and any other kind of language?
I simply mean it's the first language that I was taught to read and write. I was taught the ABC before any other alphabet, and the first books that came into my hand were written in English. And somehow that's always been so. That's the first language I choose to read and write. Although I'm so grateful for learning that English, because it's brought the literature of the world to me. I can read Russian literature, French literature, Polish literature through translation. But that's been the key to the literary world to me, for me.
Yes. And running through all your books is always something to do with an individual's emotional attachment to language, to the language they speak. And it's very much here, isn't it, in The Artist of Disappearance?
Well, at the time that I was growing up, certainly it was very much debated, it was very much in the air. Not as a child, I wasn't conscious of selecting languages and choosing languages from elsewhere. They just came to me naturally, they were in the air. But growing up, starting to write myself, becoming a writer, I was made very conscious of the fact that I was not writing in my native language. Yeah. That's because this was shortly after independence, and people were constantly asking the few writers who wrote in English at the time, why have you not switched? Why do you still write in this colonial language? The empire's over, it's done with, it's finished. Now is the time to start writing in your native language. So then I had to think, why am I doing it? And it had a way of making one very self-conscious and filling one with self-doubt also, wondering about the relevancy of what you were writing and how you were writing it. It's strange because at that time everyone prophesied that this language would disappear, that mine was the last generation that would write in English. Well, it's certainly not so at all. After the 1980s, I think, there was a big breakthrough of Indian literature in English when the rest of the world first became aware of writers like Salman Rushdie and Vikram Seth, and they were, international celebrities, and their books were translated and read everywhere. And suddenly they made it, this suddenly gave writers a confidence of just use the language you're happy to use. Write with what you are comfortable and feel freedom within. Yes.
You really did lead the way there. And one of the things that you taught me, much more than a writer I admire, like Virginia Woolf, could teach me, was, especially when I read Cold Light of Day and Fasting Feasting, was something to do with the family, the way Anita wrote up the family. That cliche of the family being a feminized subject. I think you put a stop to that. And underneath the subversively calm and delicate surfaces of your fiction, there was a great deal of turbulence in the family. You taught to me that all of life all conflicts in life can be found there. But you've also written, very interestingly, about having to move away from the role of women in the family who had to sort of cancel their own desires and serve the desires of others. For very interesting reasons, you wanted to move away from that. I wondered if you could talk about it.
Yes, it was a very deliberate decision, really. I found that while I was writing about family life, as long as I continued to do that, I was being relegated to a particular area of life. It was confined, it was restricted, it seemed not to address the larger questions of the world around me. And I thought, well, I've got to try and do something quite different. And I did it in a book called In Custody by choosing to write about a very male world. In fact, the first draft of that book had only male characters. And I was writing about an Urdu poet and all his admirers. And that was a world that women would not enter into. They would be around, but they would be behind the stage, really. They would be allowed to come in a front stage and start talking in their own voices. And I wrote the first draft in just these male voices through male experiences. And then I thought, well, this isn't natural either. Of course they have to be women. Even if you don't see them, they've got to be there behind the door. And if you listen, you'll hear them shrieking and banging on the door and being extremely bad-tempered and nasty. And then I asked myself, why are all the women characters so awful? Why are they so nasty? And I told myself, well, that's what you are. If you're always being suppressed, ignored, yes, then you will start shouting and banging on the door. So that book wasn't, for me, a sort of a break into another area which I hadn't felt very comfortable to begin with, but then got more and more so. I think the next book I wrote was Baumgartner's Bombay, in which the central character was a man. Yes. And I had him play out his history on a larger stage. But I still go back to that old world, which I'm still the most familiar with, which is the woman's world.
In The Artist of Disappearance, we don't so much have family. We have three quite solitary characters at the heart of each of the novellas. For those of you who haven't yet read it, I have to say that I don't think storytelling gets more skilled than this. Anita gives the human subject space to breathe, to think, to lament, to weigh up, to wish, to question, to remember, and perhaps to invent memories too. And set in modern India, you move us out of the cities, into the mountains in the title story, and then into quite dusty, desolate places. Would you talk a little bit about place in The Artist of Disappearance?
Well, to tell the truth, place is always where I've started any work with. It's always place which starts me thinking, how do I populate the space? Who would I meet over here? How would they live over here? And that's how the story grows. But at the root is the place from which they come. They would be different if they didn't belong right there. And so each of these stories is placed in a very specific area.
I asked Anita whether she would mind reading from the middle novella. translator translated. And here we go. Maybe you could introduce the story.
Well, this is a question that's intrigued me over the years, really, over the decades, is one of translation. Perhaps it's to do with having more than one language at one's hand, which has made me aware of why do you choose this particular language to say this, and that language to say something else. And each language has a spirit of its own too. Just like place has, so does a language really. Certain emotions, experiences can be best put into one language rather than the other. And the central novella here, which is called Translator, Translated, has very much to do with that matter of translation. But how does it start off? It starts off with a rather sad, disappointed lecturer in a women's college in Delhi, and the meeting that makes her think of translating a little-known language into a well-known language, and perhaps through that transforming herself from being a character, a person no one has noticed, and perhaps transforming her into a completely different kind of person. It starts with her first meeting, which brings this about. Prema's astonishment at being recognized made her tongue-tied. As a schoolgirl, she had never gone up and spoken to Tara. There had been no occasion to do so. Only once was a connection made, when she threw a ball right across the court with an unaccustomed, even anguished force, and Tara, leaping to catch it, twirled so that her short pleated skirt whipped about her hips and effortlessly, balletically lifted the ball into the net to eruptions of cheers. Now Prema could find nothing to say. If only there were again a ball to fling and to catch so gloriously. Finally, "It's been a long time," she stammered, and wished she had dressed better and brought her new handbag with her instead of the cloth satchel into which she stuffed books, papers, everything, just the way only the most despised and unfashionable teachers did. "Not when one is back here, it's changed so little," Tara said easily. "Miss Dutt is gone, of course. I wish I'd come sooner and seen her again." Miss Dutt, the dragon? She wished she had seen her again? Prema blinked. It just showed what different worlds they occupied. To Prema, Miss Dutt had never been anything but a scourge and a terror. She could still remember the withering stare she cast at Prema's battered shoes, unshined, slovenly and uncouth. "One is too busy," she said finally, awkwardly. "Where is the time?" She should not have said that. It made Tara ask, "What have you been doing all these years?" Which of course uncovered the hollowness of Prema's words. What had she been doing that she could talk of, compared with Tara's achievements, of which everyone knew? Prema had kept herself informed of Tara's career. How could one not, when it had been so much mentioned in the media? One of the first interns to be taken on by a national paper, later a contributor to an international magazine, especially popular in their part of the world, eventually with her own syndicated column. It had been a bit surprising when she gave up her career in journalism and took up publishing instead. In those days, not so glamorous as it seemed to have become now. She had founded the first feminist press in the country and made it unexpectedly the first, could I have some water? And made it unexpectedly, thank you, an outstanding success. At least once a week, a photograph of her attending a conference or speaking at a seminar appeared. And how could Tara possibly have kept herself informed of Prema's progress or stasis? Naturally, there was no mention of that to be found anywhere. But now there was a flurry of activity up on the stage. They're at a school function. Behind the row of potted palms, while the microphone was shifted and adjusted, figures came and disappeared. The next item on the program was revealed to be not quite ready. And Tara seemed willing to carry on this pointless conversation that Prema wished she had not begun. Then a providential act took place. A small grubby paper bag slid out of the overstuffed, ungainly satchel that Prema was trying to keep from falling off her lap. And as Prema tried to stuff it back before any further objects followed it out, Tara, idly continuing the conversation since nothing else seemed to be happening, asked, "What is that you're reading?" Prema had to hold it out for her observation so as not to seem unduly secretive, confident that Tara could not read the script in which it was printed. So distant was it from life here in the capital. But as she did so, the thought flitted across her mind like an unforeseen fly that Tara may be genuinely interested, since she was a publisher and in a very specialized field. Prema realized that there was, after all, something about which they might converse. "It is an Uriya," she said, handing over the soiled copy and regretting how badly she'd used it, dog-earing the pages, scribbling in the margins, even putting down cups of tea on the cover so that the lurid illustration of a forest fire, a burning hut, and a fleeing woman was marked with brown rims. "It's very good," she hastened to assure Tara, in spite of its appearance to the contrary. "Very moving. Who is it by? And do you read Uriya?" Prema fussily adjusted the spectacles on the bridge of her nose, in an embarrassment grotesquely enlarged by the lenses. "It was my childhood language, and it's written by a woman who comes from the same area where my mother lived. She's very much respected there, even if no one knows about her here." Tara continued to hold the book and turn its pages as if they could impart something to her. On stage, a row of schoolgirls in the school uniform of pleated skirts, white blouses, knitted ties, limp socks, and once white gym shoes had lined up to sing. But the book seemed to interest her more, even if she couldn't read one letter in that script. When the song on stage ended, rising in a crescendo that couldn't possibly be maintained and was not, she handed the book back to Prema, saying, "I wish I could read it. I'm thinking of starting a new division of my publishing house. We are publishing texts in English, you see, but I want to branch into translations now and publish writers well known in their own regions but unknown outside, which is such a shame. What do you think?" Inarticulate Prema could not at first reply, but her spectacles glittered with the enthusiasm of her unspoken response, until just before the principal's speech began to be broadcast, the loudspeaker causing it to echo at fluctuating volume, she managed to say fervently, "That's a wonderful idea. That is what we need."
Thank you. Tara is a fashionable feminist publisher. She wears minimalist saris. Her office is a shiny new high-rise. And she wears big sunglasses. And there's Prema, who can't believe her luck at this encounter. She's modest and she's self-effacing. And some of the ways in which Anita deals with character really makes me laugh, because you're so witty. Anyone who really thinks about life and observes human beings acutely, as you do, I think would be witty. But the thing is that Tara, Anita, you're suggesting that she never actually asks Prima why she's interested in the language she's translating. That's important to you, that lack of the question.
It's important because it shows how much of her interior life, which is her real life, she has to keep suppressed. She's never been able to project it, to talk to anyone of it. It's something that's been suppressed inside her. And I think many of the characters I write about are those who have whole worlds suppressed inside them, which they have no means of expressing.
Yes. And then you have a little prod at Simone de Beauvoir, which made me laugh. Prima is a bad-tempered teacher. Her students don't like her very much, although she perks up when she gets her commission to make this translation, and all her students think that maybe she's in love. But when she wants to write her PhD on the work of Suwarna Devi, this little-known writer out of her region, you have the students say to her, "Oh, no. You're not going to get on in life. You need to learn French or Chinese. And if you don't read Simone de Beauvoir, you're nothing." And it's as if you're suggesting that the concerns of the French chignoned one are really very out of place in this dusty village. Would you say something there?
It has to do with place again, yes. A book by Simone de Beauvoir, which the women she meets in this little poor cottage in a dusty little town brings in a completely different element. It's never occurred to Prema before to link herself with such a writer. So,
and later you have her say to Tara, "Well, if I translate her, she will be almost as well known as Simone de Beauvoir." Made me laugh a lot. If we move on to the title novella, The Artist of Disappearance, again we have the central character, Ravi, out of the family. He's an adopted son. He's ill-treated by his family. And when he winds up living in the burnt-out family house, he starts to make something that he wants to keep secret. I wondered what was your inspiration for that garden he makes in the mountains?
well, as in all books, so many different elements come together from different parts of one's life, and one's quite surprised oneself how they suddenly are like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that have been lying scattered, and then suddenly you see, oh, but they do fit together. So, well, the little town up in the mountains that the story is set in actually is the place where I was born, in the Himalayan mountains, and as children we used to roam around all over the mountains and come across odd things like this burnt house, which nobody knew much about it, had been burnt long ago. No one remembered who'd lived there or how it had been burnt down. That leaves room for your imagination, doesn't it? When one doesn't know the facts, when one has to imagine them. That's how fiction begins, I suppose. But there was actually, in a completely different part of India, a very strange man who was actually a builder of roads, a road engineer, I suppose you would call him. And then it came to people's notice that this road engineer had been spiriting away all these leftover bits from his projects and carting them off to an unknown destination that people stumbled upon. And he was creating sculptures out of, all these bits of metal and steel and glass and things that he built up. And he became extremely famous, It became a place that everyone visits when they go to Chandigarh. The government gave him a plot of land where he could put up his sculpture. He became extremely famous, unlike my character.
You have him disappear.
Yes.
When a film crew from the city arrive and they glimpse this garden, Ravi hides. And he starts to make a smaller garden inside a matchbox. So it's almost as if you're saying there isn't enough space for privacy, for introspection, for self-expression that doesn't suddenly become that's different from the kind of celebrity 24 wired world of tweeting and Facebook and all the rest of it. But they're all doing something with their hands, your characters. I mean, Ravi, I often think that all that connectivity that we all do on our phones and all the rest of it, it's just something to do with our hands. It's nice to have something to do. And Ravi makes a garden, and Prima tries to express something through her translation and becomes unstuck because she starts to rewrite the writer's book. So what a horror to think about, as someone who has been translated all over the world. But I wanted to ask you about your Borges quote at the start. One thing does not exist, oblivion. Could you talk about what that meant to you in its connecting conversation with the book?
I meant not everything in one's life comes together. Not everything becomes known. Not only not to others, but even to yourself. There's so much that is kept unsaid and secret. And the character Ravi is the one who's lived his entire life by keeping everything very secret, very private. But that doesn't mean that he's oblivious of it. Everything has been retained inside him.
Yes.
As memories are, whether we are aware of them or not. But they exist. And to him, in the end, it isn't so important whether he is able to continue with his garden or whether he has to reduce it all to a matchbox in his pocket. And actually, more than this line from Borges, which actually I love, this poem, I think it's called Everlasting. is a story that is told, I forget by whom, maybe by Solzhenitsyn, I'm not sure, about a musician who is put in a concentration camp, and life is of course hopeless. But what he does, he picks up sticks in that compound and he constructs a sort of a piano with them. Of course, he can't play on those sticks. No sound ever appears. No sound is produced by that wooden box that he has made. But he plays on it and he hears that music, that inner music.
Yes. And then at the start of the title story, Ravi's adopted family, middle-class Indians, who treat him shockingly. They go off on holidays without him, they exclude him. But there's this one moment where Ravi's father, who likes dancing, he's quite an outgoing man, unlike his adopted son, and they go to a club and he dances with the wife of an Englishman. And then in short, precise sentences, you show something about how it is to live in the long shadow of colonialism. Because this English officer comes out into the car park and he's got a truncheon and he just starts to beat Ravi's father about the head. It's just an unforgettable, very short paragraph. I don't know what to ask you about that, except to say it is a shocking, brilliant moment in this very quiet story.
Well, I used that incident to show Ravi's father, who's quite a dapper little man and loves to dance and loves to go to parties, how at that moment his spirit is broken.
Yes.
And it's set during the war, when there was a large military presence, of course, in India. And that is the time when Ravi's father realizes that this society that he was aspiring to and thought he belonged to, in fact, actually rejected him, did not think he had any reason to be part of it at all. And that officer, who's of course at a party rather drunk and can't bear the sight of his wife dancing with this native.
And just felt entitled to do whatever he liked. Anita, I've got my timepiece here. I can't believe it's 6:45. And we haven't even begun to discuss the first story, which is good, because all the more reason to buy The Artist of Disappearance. Before we hand over to the floor, I just wanted to end our conversation with a quote from the writer and critic Claire Massoud in the New York Review of Books. She says this of The Artist of Disappearance: Desai is a writer of great subtleties, whose novels, and in this case novellas, are replete not only with evocative descriptions and elegant syntax, but with complex emotion and profundity, of which may demand a close or second reading. That is to say, Desai is only a quiet writer if you aren't properly listening. So if we could have the lights up and take questions from the floor. We have about 15 minutes. So we have a question over here. If you wouldn't mind going, there's a microphone just behind you. It says microphone 1. Okay.
I'm intrigued as to where Ravi came from in your consciousness. Or how did he come forth to you? Because it would seem to me that he's the sort of person that was quite very, very different to you and would have had a very, very different upbringing to you. It wouldn't have been part of the way you were brought up, but you conceived him, and I'm wondering where it came from.
Actually, I think writers put something of themselves into every character they're writing about, whether it's Prema, this failed translator, or whether it's Ravi, who is building this garden that he wants no one to see, he wants no one to enter. I think a writer puts a bit of themselves into every one of those characters. We are fragmented characters ourselves, I think.
Yes. Another question from the floor there.
I was just wondering, when you started to write the 3 novellas, did you have a plan to put them all in a book together, or did they come from different places and then you decided that they would fit together?
I really had no plan and no overarching theme at all. They just happened to belong to a certain time in my life when I felt these are the 3 stories I want to write. And I did write them very quickly. Unlike my novels, I wrote them very fast, very quickly. I think I'd been waiting for the right time when I could finally sit down and write them. And it's really that time which links them rather than anything else in my mind. Though I'm always amazed at what writers see in the stories, not always what I managed to see.
I got the feeling you really enjoyed writing these novellas. Yes. Am I right?
I did. A novel is such a different thing, and mostly I write novels. I think of myself as a novelist. And they go on, and they require so much constantly renewed energy and stamina, because you can write certain parts of a novel with energy and other parts you fail to find that. And it requires a lot of strength and stamina. But these short novellas seemed to me perfect. I could say just what I wanted to say, and I was not going to be drawn into stretching them out.
There's a question over here.
When you write about these characters and when you write about their sense of alienation and displacement, how much do you get involved? You said part of you gets involved, but do you get involved with their highs and their lows, and how much of you gets involved with them? Do you get pulled down when these characters go down? And which is your favorite character of all the ones you've written? That I really want to know.
Well, yes, of course one lives with one's characters while one is writing about them. You have to carry that world inside you, which is separate from the world you're actually living in and moving around in. But inside you have to keep this inner world and keep it alive by constant attention, certainly. That's one part of your question, yes. And the other...
Could you speak right into the microphone?
And of all the characters you've created, which is your favorite one?
I've really never given that any thought.
The closest.
I don't think I have favorites. It's very strange, but they live for a while and then they disappear.
Not yet, maybe.
I haven't held on to anyone as my favorite.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question over here. At the top here.
Oh, hello. I really enjoyed your short story about the translation of the novel by Prema. Do you believe that a translation can ever truly be a representative of a person's work if it's translated from one language into another?
Well, I'll tell you where the story came from. I had, years and years ago, written a short story I called The Accompanist, which was actually about a musician who plays the accompaniment for a great maestro, for a soloist, and spends his entire life in the background playing these perfect accompaniments that no one notices at all because everyone's paying attention to the maestro they've come to hear. And I wrote a very brief story, and that was the end of it, I thought, but I felt this character continued to intrigue me. I was absorbed by his problems, and when I wrote translated, I realized I'd reverted to that character, the accompanist. And to begin with, Prema is a person who's willing to be the accompanist in the background. But her work on the translation transforms her. It gives her confidence in her ability to write, perhaps write on her own. So she takes a step too far and starts to rewrite the book, cease to be that faithful translator that all writers hope to have. But why should one? Why should one? Of course, as I said, a language has its own spirit. And just by changing from one language to another is bound to bring about a transformation. So that's something that keeps writers very fascinated too.
Question here.
My question is whether a writer, whether they are exiled or self-exiled in their own country, whether there is any dynamics in their mind to isolate themselves from the society to reflect what they write, even either as a writer or a novelist or a writer in short stories or whatever.
Well, if I understand you rightly, I think you're talking of the problem a writer has, a kind of paradox. Your own world is an interior world, and yet you're putting your work out for the public. Eventually the public is going to look at it, read it, interpret it. And it's this difficult balancing act that we have to keep performing between that private self, without which the word would really have no meaning, and the public. And it's difficult for a writer because by habit we are observers, not participants. By habit we step aside and we watch without taking part. But our subject, our material is the world, and we do have to step into it. We can't participate in it, but we do have to step into it, otherwise we'd not have the material to work on. So it's a constant problem for a writer.
Quite the way I hear. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think Allen Ginsberg was very good on that question. He said about poetry isn't an expression of the party line. It's that time of night when you lie in bed and you think what you really think, the thoughts you really think, and make the private public. That's what poetry is, and I think that's what fiction is too.
And to do it without distortion, without dishonesty, that is what one aims for, that is what one hopes to achieve.
This is what you have achieved. We've got one more question. Yes.
Firstly, Anita, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences, which enriches our appreciation of your work. I was curious when you were talking about the suppression that many of your characters have with dislocation, how your relationship with the German language, which you mentioned was your first language in a way, it isn't your literary language. How do you think, feel, or relate to that as a language of writing very strongly?
Yes. Well, I'd been writing for quite a long time before I came to write Baumgartner's Bombay. And I was writing in English and trying to convey this rhythms and sounds of the different languages I heard around me, Urdu especially in custody. And all the time I thought there's a part of my tongue that I'm leaving unused. I would so much like to use it. There are certain things I can only express in German, and I can't because I'm writing in English. So eventually I had to find a way to release this, what I was suppressing. And German in India sounded a great eccentricity. I didn't see how anyone could get by in India with knowing only German. So I had to find a way, and I did it by inventing this character called Baumgartner, who's a German Jewish refugee who comes to India and never returns to Germany, stays on in India. And through him I was able to bring in the kind of German sounds and rhythms and idiom that my mother would often use when speaking English in India. So I wrote it with a great sense of release.
Thank you for your question.
I'd like to ask two questions. Was there any particular writer who inspired you at the beginning of your literary life and who you have sustained an interest in? And the other question is, I recently read The White Tiger, which creates quite a few impressions of India. I'd like a couple of comments on how you see that book, or whether you have actually read it yourself, and whether it is modern India, The White Tiger.
Well, the very first book I remember that shook me to my core, and I thought, if words can do this, then this is what I would like to aspire to and try, was Wuthering Heights, at a very young age, certainly. But it is not a book I returned to. I daren't read it again. I daren't read it and find out, would I have the same experience now? I don't think I would. That belonged to a certain time in my life. And after that, I've acquired so many other models and writers I've looked up to and admired at different stages of my life. Adiga, as you say, belongs to a very different generation and a very different approach to writing. If I'm not mistaken, he is a journalist by profession, that he had worked as a journalist, I think, before he wrote and became known as a novelist with his first novel, The White Tiger. And I think that tells. It's not a work of imagination. It's a journalistic work. He's giving you a picture of the India he sees and that exists today.
I think the imagination's a good note to end on. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I firmly believe we should always end with the writer's own words. So I'm just going to quote two lines from The Artist of Disappearance. This is from Translated. We are all in this together, this world of loss and defeat. All of us, every one of us, has had a moment when the window opened, when we caught a glimpse of the open, sunlit world. And it continues, but I'm going to leave that for you to find out. Anita will be signing books in the foyer, and our great thanks to Anita Desai tonight.